you had a job interview. So how does the job interview with Eddie Van Halen go?
Well, that's
Go ahead and string this guitar. Good. All right, good. Can I wipe this one down? All right, good.
Yeah, kind of. Well, I flew out to LA, and Matt Bruck, who I'm sure you guys know of Matt.
Yeah.
Matt, I took a cab to the Sportsman's Lodge and got checked in, and Matt picked me up, and we went to 51.
Right across the street from that Ralph's, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
We love Ralph's. It's a great store.
Yeah.
I've been often.
And we go to 5150 and walk in, and Matt takes a guitar out of a gig bag and he hands it to me, and he said, "You're to set this up the way you think Ed would like it, and I'm to give you absolutely no information to go by."
What?
And I'm thinking, okay.
And we put a blindfold on you. Go.
Yeah,
And the lights are out.
Nothing like Trial by Fire or Crash and Burn, you know.
And you've got 30 seconds.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, I figure, you know, if this was easy, I wouldn't be here. And I know that they're on at least their third guy in production rehearsal. So things aren't going well at this point. So I have to think, how far outside the box do I have to make this for it to work for Ed? So I remember Ed and I met the first time in 1987. I was the house audio engineer at Starwood Amphitheater in Nashville. And we ended up, that's a whole nother story, which is really cool, but I digress. I remember, you know, shaking hands with him. He had a really strong grip. So, you know, you press the string on the fingerboard, it meets the fret, you get the note. If you press really hard, the string meets the fingerboard, and the note that you just had is really sharp. So I figure Ed's got a hell of a left hand. I'm going to have to set the intonation flat enough so that when he grabs the neck, the notes are right. Well, when you strike a note on a guitar to tune it, the note starts out going sharp and then it settles into pitch. Ed Van Halen's not going to stay in one place long enough for a note to settle into pitch. So as you pick the string, I figured that's got to be the note. He's also a classically trained pianist. So the strings open on the guitar don't mean anything. They have to be in tune with themselves where he's playing for any given song. So I figure first position, fifth position, I'd temper tune the guitar in the fifth position and then split the difference to the first position. And that'd give me kind of an in-between that he could go to. Now, if you do that, the high, you know, for guitar players, the high E string, or in Ed's case, we tune down a half step. So the high D sharp is literally 14 cents flat. Which means that if I played one of Ed's guitars the way that I play my own guitars, I'd sound like a blithering idiot because I'd be so out of tune, it was ridiculous. But I thought, okay, this is as far off center as I can make it. And if it's wrong, I've had a chance to have a shot at working with arguably the greatest guitar player of our time. And it was just an honor to be there. So I get it the way I want it. I walk up to Matt and I hand it back to him. And he says, "You done?" I said, "Yeah." And he looked at me, he said, "Are you sure?" "Yeah, I'm sure." "Okay." He said, "I'll take it up to the house. It'll play it. You know, we'll see what happens."
Head down to the Ralph's and wait for us there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, the funny thing is, you know, Matt said, "I'll be back in a few minutes. Make yourself at home." I'm in the studio at 5150. I'm going to make myself at home. I sat on my hands for 10 minutes because I'm not touching anything. You know, I wanted to just look around, but it's like, that's not happening.
Right.
So a few minutes go by and Matt walks back in the door with the guitar over his shoulder. And he says, "Dude," big smiles right out of the box. He said, I've been with Ed for 17 years. He said, you're the closest guy so far. He said, Ed has told me, he said, nobody in the world, not even me, can tune a guitar for him. And he set the guitar aside. He handed me another one. He said, Ed wants you to take this one back to your hotel, wave the magic wand over it. I'll pick you back up tomorrow at 4 o'clock. He wants to know if you're good or if you're lucky. And I came back at 4 o'clock the next day, and Ed came in, and we hadn't seen one another since 1987, or actually 93 was the last time that I'd seen him. And he walks in the door and he looks at me, he goes, I know you. And I said, yes, sir, you do. And he says, I don't remember why I know you, but I know that I know you. And we had a conversation that is also kind of funny, but as we reached the point where he looked over his shoulder and saw the guitar sitting on the bench, he said, is that the one that you worked on? And I said, yes, it is. And he went over and he picked it up and he put it up to the neck up to his ear and he played a chord and he said, it's perfect. He said, where have you been all my life? I said, on the other end of the phone, waiting for you to fucking call me.
Hey, Tom,
I've had the telephone number since 1987, for Christ's sake.
Tom, you
But-
just reminded me of something. Totally forgot about this. The first day I was in the rehearsal studio with Ed, before the story about Ralph's, he came over to me. We'd never met before, and he looks at me and says, "We've met." And I said, "No, sir, I don't believe we have." And he said, "Yes, we've met. I know you."
Perfect.
And I said, "Wow, I believe, sir, I don't believe we've met." He said,
Yeah.
"No, we've met." And then I started thinking about it and I said, "Oh, wait a minute. Probably 15 years earlier, I was backstage at the Cow Palace with Alex,
There you go.
and Ed came into the dressing room, and just briefly, I was playing Alex the Buddy Rich drum tapes.
Oh, nice.
And Ed comes in, he's like, "Come over here, you got to listen to this with me." And they were laughing, and then Ed left. And I thought to myself, is it possible he could remember me from that one brief
Absolutely.
encounter all those years ago? It blew my mind. That was the only
Absolutely.
explanation.
Tom, it's funny you were talking about about Ed's tuning, about so what do you call that? Like, what is that tuning style called? Like, it's like 14 cents, sharp or flat. Like, is there a term for that?
It's temper tuning.
Temper tuning. Okay.
You're setting the temperament from one note to the next. On guitar, it would be in the range of where the player's playing it. It's very, and Greg will tell you, it's how pianos are tuned. So that's a very important part of tuning. But guitar players never pay attention to that stuff.
Right. Yeah, they just play it if it's in tune. If it's not, they say it's not in tune.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or we make feedback until we figure out what's out of tune, and
My guitar techie, he played in a band that opened for Van Halen on the 2004 tour. They were called Jonas and the Massive Attracts, or just Jonas at the time. And
I saw that.
Yeah, you were there. And he would tell me stories about, they did like that whole first leg with them. And Ed would literally just pop his head into Corey's dressing room and be like, "Hey, want to come play some guitar?" And he's like, Ed would put his guitar on me. He's like, "I played the Frankenstein." He's like, "I played the Wolfgangs." And he's like, no matter what, he's like, whenever I'd hit it, it was always out of tune. He's like, and then I realized that he was playing, his high strings were all like slightly flat. And Ed was like, yeah, he's like, I have to play it like this, or else as soon as I hit a chord, it goes sharp. So he has to tune it down. So It's cool that you confirmed that.
well, the thing about it is 14 cents is not slightly out of tune.
No, that's a lot.
Hey, Tom, a quick step back to that. A minute ago, we were talking about Ed's recall ability. So right after he was adamant about, I know you, we've met, the next thing he asked me was, you got some wire cutters? And I'm kind of looking around and I'm like, "Oh, no, sir, I don't believe I have any here." And the next thing I know, someone hands him some wire cutters and he starts trimming his fingernails with them. And I said, "Sir, I've got nail clippers right here." And he's like, "No, I like to cut them with the wire cutters."
Oh, this is fantastic.
Oh, dude, that's gonna be the next trick, man. Always need to have a pair of wire cutters to cut your nails.
Yeah.
Why you use a cutter? Let's say Eddie Van Halen does. I gotta use Eddie Van Halen. It's good enough for him.
I like
Yeah.
wire cutters.
Yeah. Tom, I want to talk about Ed's guitar tone a little bit, on those live shows, because I got 3 5153s here in my house.
Okay.
Heads. So how stock were those 5153 heads that he was using on that 07 tour, and how did it progress to when we got to the 5153S on the 2015 tour?
Well, there have been several revisions to those amplifiers. The one thing that I think the coolest thing that I can say about all of that is that the amp that you play at home is exactly the amp that Ed played on stage.
Mm.
There weren't, if there were ever modifications done, it was to address a thought or an issue that we uncovered by touring with the amps, and that revision or redesign to compensate for something was always incorporated into the next series of amplifier. This was a situation where, the EVH brand is no longer it was no longer a PV 5150 or a Music Man Wolfgang guitar. This said EVH on it. And Ed was absolutely adamant that what the customer paid for was exactly what he got, what he had. And he was so adamant about consistency in the product that I'd seen him yell at guys from Fender that would bring something for him to check out, an amp to check out. And we're talking about a guy that, on the first tour, he would look at me and he'd have this kind of, what was that look on his face. As loud as the guitar rig was, and as Ed's hearing was not that good, but he could hear 3 millivolts of bias drift during a show. He'd look at me and with a kind of one of those scrunched up nose looks, and that was my cue to at that point, the first amplifiers, I couldn't check the bias, so he had me replacing tubes between songs. So my first contribution to that whole 5150 thing, I basically insisted that Dave Friedman come out and we work on the amps and put the bias test ports and the bias control on the back of the amp so that I could monitor it during the show and adjust the bias so that we could maintain a consistent, bias across the tubes during the show without changing them.
Wow.
But you come to find out, we had a large batch of tubes that hadn't been burned in properly, like hundreds of them. So we'd get 5 shows out of one set of tubes and 2 shows out of another set of tubes and 10 shows out of another set of tubes, and everybody was like, "It's the amp, it's the amp," and no, it's got to be the tubes. I was right. So, but there have been, I don't know how many revisions there have been, since I started, but it's very important that everybody know that when you buy one, it's the same thing that Ed got. Now we set the bias a little hotter than the factory.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think the factory setting is 40 millivolts across the quartet of tubes. And I used to set them at 45, if I remember correctly. Nothing ridiculously out of line, but enough so that the amplifier really lit up like a Roman candle at that point.
Right.
Now, did we use more tubes that way? You would think so. But on the 2015 tour, I used one head with one set of tubes for almost the whole tour. We had an issue we had a tube failure that they had to find with an electron microscope.
What?
Literally, nobody could figure out what happened with this.
See,
with this.
this is why arena shows sound better than bar shows, because they ain't no microscopes at the Brass Monkey.
Well, there wasn't one at the arena either. I switched Ed to one of his backup heads, and we boxed the head up and shipped it straight to Fender. And a few days later, they got in touch with me and said, Tom, we literally had to put the tubes under an electron microscope to find the fault in one of the plates in the power gate.
Oh my God.
That's the attention to detail that Ed insisted on, because it had his name on it.